Good morning, my name is Tate. Today I'm going to be talking about cell communication disorders. A cell is the smallest structural and functional unit of an organism. In medical news today, it says the average human body has approximately 37.2 trillion cells. Not only is our body made up of cells, but each cell has a very complex process it must carry out. When all cells complete their processes correctly, life can be sustained. However, to do that, they must communicate. Any disruption in communication can lead to a cell communication disorder. Cell communication disorders are disorders that occur after a breakdown in the communication passageways that can lead to disastrous consequences. Today I'm going to be speaking about a very famous cell communication disorder. It arrived in Sicily by boat in October 1347 and over the next 5 years killed 20 million people, or rather 1/3 of Europe. If you haven't guessed it yet, I'm going to be speaking about the plague. The plague is a highly lethal and highly contagious cell communication disorder spread by the bacteria Yersinia pestis. Yersinia pestis has resurfaced several times throughout history and each time has horrific consequences. The disorder has a breakdown in the MAPK and NFKB pathways that is caused by the injection of the YOP family proteins into specific cells. These pathways are heavily involved in your body's reaction to an infection, and by stopping them, your body may never realize it is facing death. Now it's time to look at the Yersinia outer protein, or YOP family, more in depth. However, to do that, we must go back to the basics of cell communication. So, to understand cellular communication, you have to understand the terminology behind cellular communication, with words like apoptosis, protein kinase cascade, dephosphorylation, and signal transduction pathway. This may sound difficult, but signal transduction pathways are the pathways that all cells go throughout to complete their processes. A protein kinase cascade is a perfect example of a signal transduction pathway, with the 3 steps clearly illustrated. It starts with reception, when the receptor receives a chemical signal to start the transduction, or in the case of a protein kinase cascade, the phosphorylation cascade. This is when a phosphorus is added to a protein in order to activate it. And then you reach the end result of a signal transduction pathway, the response. This means that dephosphorylation is when you remove a phosphorus from the equation, causing the protein kinase cascade to never reach its end result, or a cell response. YOP-H dephosphorylates passageways that deal with inflammation, causing your immune system to never be alerted. Another way Yersinia pestis keeps the immune cells of your body from being alerted is from limited apoptosis, which just means programmed cell death. The YOP family has several different members, all with different jobs. For example, we're going to look at YOP-J. Here you can clearly see YOP-J connecting to the different intracellular materials of the MAPK cascade. MAPK is in charge of inflammation, and when YOP-J attaches to the different materials, MAPK can't carry out its function, which is, again, stops your body from being alerted to the infection. Something that I thought that was interesting was that YOP-B and D, their job is to induce cell death or cell rupture, but YOP-E and T restrict YOP-B and D because cell rupturing would mean, again, alerting the immune system. There are 3 different types of the plague. The only difference between the types of the plague are transmission and where it ends up in your body. Today we're going to talk about the types from most to least common. Starting with the bubonic plague. The bubonic plague is spread the way that people normally hear about, with an infected flea biting a human. A flea can get infected either from feeding on an infected rodent or environmental factors, but when it is infected with Yersinia pestis, the bacteria builds up in the body. So whenever a flea bites a human, the esophagus is blocked with infectious biofilm, causing the flea to regurgitate infected blood back into the human's body. Symptoms of the bubonic plague are the first signs that you should seek treatment. According to the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, symptoms include fever, chills, headaches, weakness, and 1 or more swollen, tender, and painful lymph nodes called buboes. Buboes is derived from the Greek word vulvon and the Latin word bubo, vulvon meaning groin and bubo meaning swelling or pustulence. This is a reference to the fact whenever a flea infected with Yersinia pestis bites a human, Yersinia pestis attaches to the lymph cells and then travels to the nearest lymph nodes, most commonly being the inguinal lymph nodes and the axillary lymph nodes. The swelling is just the lymph node's natural response to infection so close. Next, the pneumonic plague. You can catch the pneumonic plague in 2 different ways. Number 1, you can have untreated bubonic plague that spreads to your lungs, or you can inhale infectious droplets of Yersinia pestis. The symptoms of the pneumonic plague are the same as the bubonic plague, but also has a quickly developing pneumonia with shortness of breath, chest pains, coughs, and watery or bloody spit. Next, we have the least common form of the plague, the septicemic plague. The reason this is the least common is because the septicemic plague is spread the same way the bubonic plague is spread, by a flea biting a human. The only way this is different, however, is that the Yersinia pestis never makes it to your lymph nodes. Instead, the bacteria freely replicates in your bloodstream, causing it to be the least common and the most deadly. The mortality rates of the plague depend on how quickly and how effectively you're treated. For instance, the bubonic plague has a 1 to 15 mortality rate if treated, but a 50 to 70% chance of dying if left untreated. The pneumonic plague has an unknown mortality rate when treated, but it has a 100% fatality rate if left untreated after the first 24 hours of showing your first symptoms. The septicemic plague also has a 100% mortality rate if left untreated, but it also has a 40% mortality rate if treated. The plague has a very rich and interesting history. It's resurfaced several times throughout history, and the most devastating ones are called the three resurgences. The first resurgence was the plague of Justinian. This is named after the Roman emperor at the time, Justin, who caught the bubonic plague but managed to survive. This lasted from 541 AD to 542 AD and killed an estimated 25 to 50 million people. The second pandemic was the one we most commonly hear about, the Black Death. This occurred in 14th century Europe and lasted from 1347 to 1352 AD. It killed, like I said earlier, 1/3 of Europe. The third or modern pandemic lasted from January 1894 to 1959, which means since it was so long, we don't have an estimated death toll. People in the 14th century didn't have the same grasp on science and medicine like we did, so there were different theories on why the plague could be happening. Some things include punishment from God, Jews or foreign people poisoning the water, bad air, and my favorite, the triple conjunction of Jupiter, Mars, and Saturn in the 40th degree of Aquarius. Because there were so many different ideas about why the plague started, everybody tried to stop it in their own way. One interesting example of this are flagellants. Flagellants were a group of people, typically men, who would travel from town to town and a couple of times a day would go outside and begin to whip each other or any passerbys who got too close and attempt to atone for their sins and keep them and their family members safe from the plague. Another interesting example that we see from the plague are plague doctors. Their bird-like beaks were actually filled with herbs and flowers to attempt to filter out the bad air that they thought was spreading the plague. Their eyes were actually covered with glass, and they were from head to toe covered in a large rubber cloak and tall boots in an effort to keep infectious tissue away. This is also interesting because this is where we see people saying that Ring Around the Rosie is related to the Black Plague, with the pocket full of posies being a pocket full of herbs to protect yourself and to mask the stench of the bodies, and ashes being the burning of the infected tissue. We also see this in something you commonly say with Ring Around the Rosie is a tissue, we all fall down, which refers to uncontrollable sneezing as a rare symptom of the bubonic plague, and then of course, death. So I hope you learned a lot about the plague today and realized even though some of these old-timey ways of treating the plague could seem outlandish and not really make sense, they had sound theories that they were just unable to carry out due to the medicine of the time. That's it. The end.